Hi, good morning, and welcome to this session. It's the last day of the IGF. It's early in the morning, but still great to see you. I would like to welcome first the co-facilitators of this best practice forum, Bruna, and normally we have Teresa and Sheetal online. So I don't know, Bruna, if you want to say hi too?
Yeah, hi everyone, and welcome for being here this early. Well, hopefully last day, less rush until the end of this IGF, and also thanks Teresa and Sheetal for being online with us.
Yes. Hi, Sheetal. We didn't see each other for some time. So thank you for joining here and online to this session of the Policy Network on Internet Fragmentation. It is one of the intersessional activities of the IGF. It was started 3 years ago as an initiative taken by the community to raise awareness about fragmentation, to raise awareness about actions that may cause and issues that may cause internet fragmentation, and also with the purpose of facilitating the inclusive multi-stakeholder dialogue about fragmentation. Like I said, the policy network has been around for 3 years. The first 2 years we focused on exploring the field, and that led us to developing a framework to discuss internet fragmentation. If you can show the first slide number 1. There you can see on the screen normally the PNF framework we developed. Little explanation and background about this. When we started the discussion about internet fragmentation, automatically the first thing you do is to try to come up with a definition to say this is what we're talking about, this is what we want to discuss. But very quickly we discovered that focusing too much on defining what internet fragmentation is and what it is not brings us to endless discussions, endless yes, no, this you should talk about, this you cannot talk about. And that led us actually to develop a framework, a tool that is intended to facilitate the discussion, not really to define internet fragmentation, but to facilitate helping people that want to discuss fragmentation to indicate what they are talking about. And that tremendously helped us, I think, within the PNF, but we also have seen it being picked up elsewhere to kind of guide the discussions. So what's in the framework? We identified 3 different baskets of internet fragmentation. When people talk about fragmentation, they either, we discovered, talked about or from a perspective of the user experience, or they were talking about internet governance and coordination, or they were talking about the technical layer, the internet technical layer. Let's start with the last one. When they talk about fragmentation of the internet technical layer, they're basically talking about the infrastructure that underpins the working of the internet, of the global internet. And fragmenting, internet fragmentation in that context would mean anything that can challenge the interoperability of the internet as we know it today. The second basket, internet fragmentation of internet governance and coordination, is actually linked in a way to discussions we have here at the Internet Governance Forum, but also discussions going on in other fora, decision fora, also at the other organizations, and pointing at the fact that if there are too many discussions going on about the internet, about the internet, and different fora in parallel without those institutions, organizations, and platforms talk to each other, this might lead, or this might be a kind of fragmenting the internet. The last basket is, or on top, is internet fragmentation from the user perspective. Is basically the idea, the idea of the internet is that if you connect to the internet, wherever you are on the network, wherever you are in the world, you can have or you have the same expectations. You expect that you can do the same, that you can connect to the same services, the same content. We all know that this is not the case today, that when two users, it can be somebody sitting here, somebody sitting on the other side of the world. It can as well be me going online, Bruna going online, trying to do the same and getting a different result. That is also a form of fragmentation from the user perspective. It is not said that all these forms of fragmentation are problematic. Some are not. So this is the basic framework. It helps us to, when there are discussions, that people can flag, well, we see ourselves in this or that basket. Very important is also to understand that there is a relation, there is a huge overlap between the baskets, and they also interact, influence each other. And that the third element of the framework, and that's what's the gray box outside the framework, is there are a lot of measures, technical, legal, policy decisions that may influence fragmentations in the three senses, in the three boxes. So we really wanted, although this is a framework, I say, we worked on and we showed already at the IGF last year, we discussed the year before, we keep repeating it, we keep showing it, because we notice that it really helps to facilitate the discussion. I think I would like to keep it there as an introduction and then move over to the session today. And Sheetal, or the co-facilitator, will take you through the plans for today, the plans for this year. And please, Sheetal, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Wim. It's great to see you all on stage. You look super fresh for the last day of the IGF and the first session in the morning. And I hope you've been enjoying it so far, and all the long sunshine days that I hear you get in that part of the world at this time of year. I'm calling in from London, and it's great to be here for this session because, as you've explained, Wim, we have come a long way, I think, with the framework, with the work of the policy network in supporting an understanding of internet fragmentation and a basis to work from on this issue. And so with this session, we wanted to launch the work of the policy network for the coming year and be able to use this as a platform for discussion, for inclusive dialogue on what is happening with regards to internet fragmentation, to strengthen the dialogue, to be able to use this space to continue to monitor trends and discuss developments and raise awareness of what is happening and really educate the community and ourselves so that we can act with awareness. And all of this grounded in a commitment that is in the Global Digital Compact, very specifically. You will know it, paragraph 29C, which commits to promoting international cooperation among all stakeholders to prevent, identify, and address risks of fragmentation of the internet in a timely manner. I think there's a slide 2, if I can ask the tech team to display it, when you had asked me to remember that, and I forgot. So if slide 2 is available, you can have that on the screen. Yes. But that just shows the specific commitment within the compact to promote international cooperation on this particular issue. It's very clear, it's there. It's also accompanied by paragraph D, which commits to refraining from internet shutdowns and connects this commitment around fragmentation to Sustainable Development Goal 16, which is all about promoting inclusive societies and peaceful institutions, which of course an open and secure interoperable internet is so essential for. So we want to start, of course, at the beginning, which is going to lead me back to giving you the mic on the stage. It's always good to start at the beginning, where we want to ask what has actually been happening with regards to the status of this commitment, what international cooperation efforts have begun, are there any gaps, what can we bring to the table, where have we begun with regards to this commitment, and what can we do as a network and community to continue to monitor it. So back to you, and looking forward to the discussion and to hearing from all of you, both there in Norway and of course online. Thanks.
Thanks, Chital. We have a very interesting and diverse set of speakers for this session. Sorry for my voice, like last day. But I'll take a moment in introducing you all. We have Joyce by my side, Senior Advisor at Strategic Engagement at APNIC. We also have Naim, State Secretary in Montenegro. We have Michel Lambert, who I hope joins us very soon. He's the General Manager for Equality. We have Truv at the end of the table, let's say, the non-table, from the Internet Architecture Board, representing them here. And also dear colleague Marília Maciel, Director of Digital Trade and Economic Security at Tiplo Foundation. As Chital was saying, I think we can start with an initial set of interventions about the GDC commitments, right? We had a very thorough discussion of the Global Digital Compact, what it would mean for society. Also, a lot of commitments from social media platforms into information integrity and spanning out across the board from many things around internet governance. And to be fair, it's somehow unfortunate that we're having a session just now with the co-facilitators for WSIS Plus 20, where a lot of implementations and suggestions for the new framework are also being suggested. But maybe I'll start with Marília, if that's okay, starting with our remote speakers. I think if you can start us off with just some ideas and comments on how does this commitment, could be shaped, and we know that there is still a lot of efforts being implemented in terms of mapping of the GDC commitment, but at some point, until now at least, we haven't heard much from the internet fragmentation bit, as we assume it's part of an ongoing mapping as well. So I'll pass the floor to you, Marília. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bruna. I trust you can hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Just let me know. Well, thanks to the organizers of the session for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today. And since we don't have much time, let me just pick one angle of this discussion and explore it, and then make some suggestions based on the questions that were proposed to us that I think could be reflected in the upcoming report. Well, the drivers of fragmentation can be of different types, as we have discussed: technical, political, commercial. But one of the main elements that has traditionally strengthened fragmentation trends is the tension between the cross-border nature of the internet and our territorially grounded political and legal systems. But in the present geopolitical context of rising tensions, there is mounting pressure towards reinforcing territorialization. Borders are becoming ever more important, as we can see in several examples today, such as the application of unilateral tariffs on digital key products, such as semiconductors, the potential end of the moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions at the WTO, which will mean that we will pay more for films and music that will not be exempt from tariffs imposed at the border anymore, the adoption of investment screening mechanisms for inbound and outbound investment that touch upon investment on key digital sectors, including in developing countries. So there are these general ongoing trends. And when the GDPR was first introduced, the headlines talked about the return of the state to digital policy. But what is happening today is different from attempts to strengthen the authority of the state in order for it to protect individual rights and promote competition online. Today, I think particularly in developed countries, which are the front runners of digital technology, re-territorialization and digital sovereignty have been increasingly invoked to strengthen the state itself, especially when these expressions are associated with national security concerns and protectionist worldviews. So there's a growing entanglement between national security and economic security, and digital technologies cutting across both. So in this context, countries are usually pushing for a double strategy. On the one hand, they are exploiting existing digital interdependencies to achieve their geopolitical goals, while on the other hand, they are seeking autonomy for themselves in key digital areas, even if this means redefining networks of global production of goods and services. Because of this, I think it's very important that the network looks at how states are promoting fragmentation by acting upon dismantling, reorganizing the digital economy along geopolitical goals and along ideological fault lines, and how this might affect global access to technology, technology diffusion, including when it comes to hardware, software, data, algorithms, and model weights. So what I am proposing in practice, and maybe we can think about reflecting that in the report, is that first, we should add another dimension of our working notion of fragmentation, which would consider fragmentation in the global economy, while governments are acting upon markets and introducing elements of fragmentation. They do that by reducing previously agreed openness of digital markets and the openness of value chains that produce and distribute ICT goods and services, many times foreclosing these value chains to non-allies or to countries that are considered non-reliable, for example, and many of them are located in the global south. Secondly, I think it is important to broaden the scope of fragmentation in order to consider not only individual end user experience, but also the fragmentation that is affecting intermediary users, which can also be companies that employ ICT goods and services to produce their own products and services. Third, while we tweak the scope of our understanding of fragmentation, special attention should be given to developing countries and how this fragmentation would impact their access to technology and their access to investment as well in digital sectors. So what collaboration efforts have been put in place when it comes to this particular understanding of fragmentation? Not many that I'm aware of, so there's definitely a gap there, something that we can do. But some organizations have worked independently and have tried to map these effects. So the WTO, for example, was one of the first to ring alarm bells about fragmentation of global value chains. The Digital Policy Alert from the University of St. Gallen has introduced studies on fragmentation from a regulatory perspective and also from a tariff perspective. The OECD has recently produced studies on the need to find balance between free data flows and the existence of legal frameworks, and have economically quantified the sweet spot between both. But most important of all, I think we need to mobilize companies, because they're the ones who hold the main pieces of the puzzle to understand what's going on. And the Geneva Internet Platform has developed an initiative that fosters collaboration among companies when it comes to discussing responsible behavior in cyberspace. And this dialogue could serve as a blueprint to bring together companies from different digital sectors to discuss fragmentation. I think, to conclude, that the policy network is really well placed to convene multi-stakeholder discussion and to kickstart some very interesting projects with the end goal of the 2027 deadline. But the IGF itself has, by and large, refrained from discussing the issues related to the digital political economy. In fact, I think that the IGF has not really responded over the last 10 years to the significant migration of digital policy discussions, data flows, algorithms, privacy, AI, to digital trade negotiations and agreements, which are, by the way, not transparent, not accountable, not multi-stakeholder. So in itself, this migration is a fragmentation of internet governance. So perhaps there is an opportunity now for us to kill two birds with one stone and address the ongoing fragmentation of internet governance, digital governance, through discussions on fragmentation trends that we can see in the digital economy today. I think I'll stop here. Over to you, Bruna.
Thank you, Marilia, and thanks a lot for reminding us of this social political tensions, right, that we see not just in policy making, but also throughout the venues and the forums. I do think that some aspects of it we try to bring into the fragmentation of coordination, but it's true, in fact, that we didn't really address the economic aspect of the whole discussion. So thanks a lot for reminding us of that. I'll bring the conversation to you, Naim, especially for the policy-making part, right? I always enjoy the prep meetings for these sessions because I think we always kind of dive into the debate before, but I do think both conversations will bridge very well, right? And just maybe to hear from you, looking at these commitments and looking at what the GDC has meant for the discussion on internet fragmentation, how do you think you could embed those commitments, and how do you think you could contribute from a government perspective into this debate? Thanks.
Thank you, and good morning all. It's great to be here and talk about this topic, and thanks to IGF and PNI that is putting this topic on the talk. Also, thanks for the host country, Norway, for the hospitality. Fragmentation from this point of view, of governmental point of view. I know that we won't go too much on the technical details, but I have to focus on the political fragmentation and what a government can do to continue this commitment that you already mentioned, also commitments of GDC. So I will start and say how Montenegro works on this. So we don't have any fragmentations on internet, but of course we do some activities that they indirectly support evidencing the risks of fragmentations. So as a country who is running also to be part of EU, and as we're looking for single market that it's also included with the fragmentation, and I mean a common internet and all economic activities, we of course work on strategic plans that indirectly stops fragmentations through having same directives with the EU members. Not only EU, but we as a region of Western Balkans, we're trying to have the same digital strategies and all activities, starting also from the legal framework. So this is important, starting with the legal, and after that, of course, implementing that. For us, this is a very important topic. Unfortunately, not only in Montenegro, but even in other countries, we don't have legal something that will define fragmentation, stops this. And of course, all stakeholders. I always love to put in one table always about these important topics, even government organizations, but also universities, private sector, NGOs that can also give a huge effect to this and other topics, especially in part of digitalization, because this is a live system and changes a lot. And of course, representatives of groups that we cannot see too much. And those are youth and also representatives of regions from globally that they are not too much active on these topics. So we have to have all these elements at the same table and start working on the legal part to stop fragmentation. Also, I said that we did a lot on part of stopping fragmentation indirectly, but there are factors that can affect Montenegro and having some fragmentations. Not only Montenegro, the same way that can be also be active in other countries. So as mostly we know that 3 years ago in Montenegro we had a huge cyber attack, so this can also happen to we as a government stop and look our position and to save our information, government information, but also citizen information. So we have to start with some fragmentation, even if we are not on that side. So the second point that is a factor of opening the fragmentation is this that I already mentioned, the legal framework. And the third of course, is that gap. Even in our region, Western Balkans, we did really a great job of connectivity to internet. So this also, that gap that is still there between parts in our country, especially rural parts, that they cannot catch too much of services, and connectivity to internet can help and brings indirectly and be a factor of fragmentation. But still, I think that starting from the positions that I am and all other persons working in the government should really start more and bring this topic to a higher level. So even from the legal and other activities. So I think that for the beginning would be this from my side, but still these activities, maybe I always say, even inside our country, when we wait for some results, maybe we don't get that as we wanted, that communication beside all actors and stakeholders. So that would be my point, that the communication, starting from regions, then continent, then global, should really be direct and better communication. So maybe that would be how to improve these committees of GDC. That would be to make some roadmap, like to see the activities, what stakeholders are doing in this topic, and to have the common roadmap, but not just a roadmap that is written, but what really to be that all stakeholders should respect that and really work on achieving some results of stopping and of fragmentation. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that from what your intervention, I would maybe highlight this need for nearer commitments, right? And nearer for, not just nearer commitments, but a more aligned conversation of what fragmentation could mean, what states should be doing for that. The EU, as you were saying, has already a lot of initiatives in that sense, but there are some gaps, right, with the accessing states and also some regions of the continent as well that might be lacking or might not be as represented in this debate. But it's also a conversation for the rest of the world, right, and where we, as you were very well highlighting, we should include more and more voices. I will maybe bring it to another of our remote speakers, Michelle. I don't know if you can hear us, and if can you hear us well, and are you ready to speak? I'm not sure if you can unmute yourself, but if technical can help us, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thanks for joining us, Michelle. You told us you would like to address the gaps, right? And the gaps specifically in fragmentation, and also knowing you're part of the SplinterCon community. We're all very keen to hear you speaking about the gaps on this conversation. So the floor is yours.
Okay, I was trying to open my camera, but it doesn't work. That's okay, at least we have the sound. So yes, thank you first for the invitation. I'll take just a few seconds to mention that I'm working for a group called Equality, the Canadian non-for-profit organization, and what we do, we develop open source technologies to support digital and community resilience, particularly in environments affected by censorship. So that's why we run the SplinterCon series, which bring together, researchers, developers, technologists, entrepreneurs, internet freedom advocates to, look at all the issues of fragmentation and find ways to go around. So that's such, we work directly with communities affected with network shutdown, filtering or target digital repression. And from our own perspective, there are at least two urgent and under-addressed gaps that demand immediate attention from our community. And we call the first one the political normalization of network control. It's a big word. Tools of censorship, surveillance, and fragmentation are no longer exceptional. They are becoming normalized instruments of governance. We are witnessing a global shift where controlling internet access is increasingly equated with sovereign state power. And this is not happening on the margin, it's happening at scale. And yet, even in this week of a high-level discussion on internet governance, censorship and shutdown felt a bit absent from the agenda. We discussed a lot about AI, but these emergencies seem a bit overlooked. For instance, I maybe have missed, but I've seen no formal discussion on Iran's recent full-scale shutdown affecting nearly 90 million people these last 10 days, as we were speaking. Very little serious engagement also with the ongoing restriction on Palestinians, restricted to 2G networks, digital ghettoization that has persisted for years. So this is just two examples, but they're not isolated events. They're part of a global pattern that will continue unless we act much more. Efforts like the Best Practice Forum on protecting core internet resource in context of conflict are welcome. I think it happened yesterday, and we intend to support them, but we must scale this effort, and this discussion should be more integrated, not only restricted to the policy network on internet fragmentation, but more included in the whole IGF process. If we want to leave no one behind, I mean, I heard that mantra a lot the whole week. We must apply even when government decide to shut down the internet for political purposes. In this context, the GDC frame as it is, as a roadmap for right-based internet governance, risk legitimizing fragmentation. By enriching national sovereignty over domestic internet, it may inadvertently give cover to state-led shutdowns and repression. We must ensure that embedded human rights in digital governance is more than rhetorical. We need mechanisms to make it more difficult and even more costly for government to shut down the internet. If I may, I'd like to spend a few minutes just to look at the Iran's control fragmentation that we've seen this week. In the last 10 days, Iran has demonstrated a new level of sophistication in state-controlled network fragmentation. It's been like 4 times since 2009, and each time the regime learned. And now, after 16 years of trial and error, they can manage it successfully. Their national information network made sure that domestic accesses throughout the local services, bank, and internal messaging was working normally. But anything from outside to inside could not reach the servers. This is really full fragmentation in course. It's happening right now. There has been a few tools which managed to work, and without going into details of such tools, I can mention like Touche, a satellite-based file casting system, which managed to send a lot more content during those days. The Sino browser that we created is a peer-to-peer tool using BitTorrent, continued to distribute. Some matrix server work. Delta Chat is another one. But all these tools, are somehow a bit marginal in the context, and they need to be promoted before shutdown happens. So you need a lot of investment before, a lot of preparedness, and continuous innovation of these tools, because the reality is that shutdowns are becoming, the sensors are becoming more and more, performant. So the tool needs to be also updated all the time. And that takes me to my second gap here, and it really is the collapse of funding for internet freedom tools like this. It is no secret that the United States has been the primary funder of global internet freedom efforts since a few years now, contributing nearly 250 million annually. Now, the recent estimates suggest that up to 80% of this funding is being cut for this year and the year beyond. That will leave a massive gap at the worst possible time. Without immediate action from other governments, Canada, EU member states, and other allies, we risk losing essential infrastructure, tools, and networks that allow people to stay online and safe. In short term, that means We need to stabilize funding for critical tools before they disappear. We need to support local help desk, training hub, adapted version of censorships and conventional tools. We need mapping the real impact of the funding cuts to guide smart emergency level decision in the next 6 months. This is no moment for bureaucratic delays. And on the long term, really, we need to treat digital resilience as an essential infrastructure. We should support open, interoperable and sovereign alternatives to big tech. We need to mainstream encryption and privacy as fundamental rights. Digital shutdowns are no longer rare or extreme. They are part of the digital political playbook. If we fail to take them seriously, we will continue to see vulnerable communities cut off, silenced, and left behind. I'll stop here. Thanks to you.
Thanks, Michel. And thanks also for highlighting, I think it was the main point that came across to us when we were starting the framework mapping, right? That the tools, not the tools, but the abusive usage of internet shutdowns, first in the context of elections, and then in different contexts as well, as the ones you highlighted. So thanks a lot for bringing that into the conversation, and also the points on the current crisis in the development sector, right? I do believe that some of those things, they might affect in the longer run, the conversations we have. They do affect indeed the participation of civil society organizations and many other stakeholders here, but it's also important to highlight, I feel the obligation to highlight here as well that we did have in the past years many ally governments to the digital freedoms agenda as well, right? And we had spaces like the Freedom Online Coalition and many other collectives or governmental coalitions that have been trying to counter-react to the usage of those tools or try to get across with a more concrete message. But thanks a lot for highlighting those points, and as a fellow civil society member, I appreciate the points made. Dhruv, I will bring the conversation to you to talk a bit more about technical fragmentation, right? I think it was the first point that was brought up to us when we started the PNIF, and we often heard there's no technical fragmentation. Why are you guys starting this work, right? What extra things or what new things are you going to discuss? So maybe if you had any thoughts or ideas on how we could work together on the GDC commitments and in making sure that the core aspect of the internet and the critical infrastructure of it is being well kept and the commitments around it. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for giving me an opportunity to be on the panel and bring out where the technical community is coming from. I'm on the Internet Architecture Board, which is part of our Internet Engineering Task Force. We do all the internet standards. Everything that we use, IP, DNS, email, HTTP, TLS, all the protocols that we see on the internet today were standardized at ITF. And these are global standards. They are implemented everywhere. The fear from the technical community that always comes is at the technical layer, as you were also highlighting in your PNIF framework, that we lead to interoperable solutions, where instead of an internet that is fully connected, where we can communicate from any part of the world to any other networks, we end up into regional or isolated networks that no longer work with each other. That can be also at the technical layer. The thing that we worry the most is in that cases, as standards organizations and ITF and others continue to develop new standards, and we add new extensions, we enable more privacy, we enable new things. There are sometimes regulations that comes in, which has an impact not just on the country where the regulation is coming from, but on the global internet. So there is a huge fear that we have, especially in the terms of digital sovereignty and governments focusing on having more regulation and control over the internet, but at the same time realizing that it's very hard to regulate something which is completely global. The internet is without borders, but the digital sovereignty is within borders. So we have to be always mindful. We realize that the governments have a reason to regulate, they are doing something, but at the same time, internet is unique in its own way. So when they try to regulate anything, always keeping the fear of what is the bigger impact on the internet architecture, on the infrastructure, on the core technical layer, has to be always kept in the back of the mind. So when you asked what could be the next step, I hope that when these regulations comes in, there is a trust in the technical community that yes, we can rely on their expertise, that they have developed this, they have been running, there are real engineering and operational realities out there which needs to work with the regulations that is coming in. So if there could be more collaboration, more understanding from each other's point of view, that's the hope that the technical community would have and something that I personally also care for. Thank you.
Lovely, thanks. Thanks so much. And we did hear this many times across these years, right? The relevance of coordination, the relevance of like bringing the experts back into the room, right? Because it's really interesting that we come from all of these forums, IAB, IETF, ICANN, IGF on itself, and we preach about multi-stakeholderism all the time. But it's also true that when these fast policy-making decisions, they come to exist, we don't really have the time sometimes to include all the experts in the table because we're mainly focusing on giving efficient, quick answers to those problems and answers that might protect users, might make sure that the crisis, they don't go further. But indeed, it's one of the main points that we do at least have a point or more checkpoints on with the technical community, with academia, and many other experts in that sense, just so we know that we're doing the right thing and just so we know we can continue to do those types of measures and so on. And I'm going to bring it to you, Joyce, as well, because in the last 2 to 3 years, we also saw an even growing movement, right, for coordination of the technical community, especially in light of the said exclusion you guys had from the Global Digital Compact process, or the lack of acknowledgement, let's say it like that in a more diplomatic way. But maybe if you can just enlighten us on the coordination efforts that have been done recently, and also reminding everyone that you work for IPNIC, so one of the core organizations in this space, you got with the IAB and many other colleagues. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bruna, and also thank you to Wim, thank you to Sheetal for the very kind invitation to speak in this very important session. I'll first begin by talking about the Witness Elements paper. I think that has been on everybody's mind in the past week. And the Elements paper highlighted the risks of internet fragmentation as a core issue to be addressed. This shows how important and critical it is that we continue to look at this issue seriously. So I thank the PNIF for your wonderful work in this regard. You have helped us over the years to articulate what internet fragmentation is or could be. I think the real risk to internet fragmentation, and here I'm quoting, I believe it's one of the ICANN papers that they have published over the past few months, where they said the real risk to internet fragmentation is misalignment and the breakdown of coordination. And in this regard, IPNIC, as part of the internet technical community and the larger multi-stakeholder internet governance community, has always supported strong and inclusive coordination and cooperation amongst all stakeholders. One way to mitigate fragmentation is continuous capacity building, both technical and non-technical. At IPNIC, we are constantly building awareness around how the internet works, and sound technical network deployment ensures that there are no breakages in the functioning of the internet. If we look at the IGF itself is a capacity-building, confidence-building forum where the internet community can gather and talk exactly about these issues. The internet and the use of the internet are constantly evolving, and the IGF is the space for us to frame and set the agenda for discussions on fragmentation as the evolution takes place. I want to highlight that coordination is not often visible. But if fragmentation were to happen, it would take the invisible and make it visible. it would mean that the internet has points of failure. And so here I want to talk a bit about the current ICP2, or what we call the Internet Coordination Policy 2 review that is taking place. The ICANN Address Supporting Organization, or ASO, is reviewing this very important document. It's a fundamental document, which we now call the RIR governance document. This document talks about the establishment and the derecognition of RIRs. The original document was adopted in 2001, so it even predates the IGF. But it was instrumental in setting up the core internet organizations such as LACNIC and AFRINIC. Why did I bring this up? This is an example where the technical coordination is clearly laid out in the document, and if we don't do this well, there is potential for systemic failure. We have had extensive community consultations on the draft RIR governance document so far, and if you're interested or curious to know what is going on, I encourage you to take a look at this document as well, because it concerns the fundamental governance of the RIRs. Another example that I want to give of coordination within the technical community is the Technical Community Coalition on Multi-Stakeholderism, or TCCM. I think I've spoken about the TCCM across several other panels, but I think again, it's good to just talk about it, because I think their work is very relevant to us as we're talking about internet fragmentation. The TCCM is where technical operators of the internet gather to discuss core policy issues, and we started our work during the GDC and are now continuing on into the WSIS Plus 20 review process. It's a different kind of capacity building. It's not so much about technical coordination as such, but it is a form of policy coordination amongst the technical operators, and I think it is a much needed one. We're fighting internet fragmentation by building bridges between the technical and the non-technical realms. Now, I wanted to address a remark made by Michelle, and I'm so thankful that you brought this up, regarding the severe cuts in funding and how that has affected a lot of the civil society, non-governmental organizations that are doing very, very good work in trying to mitigate internet fragmentation. And I want to bring up another example where such severe funding cuts have affected especially the Pacific community. It's, to me, not just a vacuum of influence in a time of strained geopolitical tensions, but more importantly, such severe funding cuts have really hampered the Pacific community, which is far away enough from everyone, in their internet development efforts, and having them, be able to access the internet. And so this, to me, is a really important topic. I hope that we could perhaps have a little discussion around that. And so, just in summary, I think the PNIF is in a great position to continue this work on internet fragmentation and to develop recommendations for GDC implementation, because we have not really seen much work in this area as to do with the implementation itself. I think it's also crucial that the PNIF includes your voice in the WSIS Plus 20 review process. Thank you.
Thanks, Joyce. And reminding that of the high-level event in less than 10 days now, right? And hoping to see a lot of us in Geneva as well, discussing some of the same topics and some of the same need for coordination and so on. I think now we open for questions from the audience, right? So I'm not sure how do we do with the microphones, but we should have one here. And if folks would like to make a question, feel free to just jump into the queue. Do we have a microphone?
There's a mic.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Vinicius Fortuna. I work at Google. I'm the engineering lead for our internet freedom effort. And I just wanted to highlight that on the topic of digital sovereignty, it's almost like incompatible with internet as a whole, because they don't depend on other people anymore, right? So like, why would you keep communicating? I think really the key here is the interdependency. So we need to make sure that we highlight the need for this interdependency, like what are the benefits, and demonstrate that it's like more effective. You can be more efficient by depending on others. You see examples like China, for example, like they became independent pretty much, and they don't depend on external service, so they are able to block like Google and Wikipedia and many other services because they have reproduced it internally. So it makes it really easy, and you've seen that with Iran too. And things like sanctions make it worse because it kind of like forces the country to become sovereign in a way. And so we need also like to remove the sanctions that are hurting really this and accelerating the separation of Iran. So I think this is also a reflection of a bigger trend. Like we see this polarization and distrust. I think distrust is really what's pushing countries to also distrust each other and separate. So I think there's this fundamental kind of question that needs to be addressed too.
Thank you, Vinicius.
Hi. Juan Ortiz Frauler, PhD candidate in the University of Southern California. Perhaps echoing what the previous speaker mentioned, it was interesting to see how the GDC speaks in terms of protecting against internet fragmentation without really addressing the root causes of it. And I was wondering who you think is going to be the champion of this interdependence now that the US doesn't seem to be interested in doing that. Europe, with this sovereignty agenda, perhaps isn't as interested. I think some of the companies used to be, but now that we have these big tech companies, they don't necessarily need to interoperate anymore, right? Many of them are less interested in making their services interoperable. So who is left for this agenda, or is this not something that we're going to be discussing in 2-3 years because the term fragmentation is over?
Thanks, Juan. I think we have a question for remote, but I'll give you guys the chance to answer or address it. I don't know if the remote speakers and I know Joyce is gonna address it. Go ahead. You can go ahead if you want, and then I'll check the remote. Yeah.
Okay, so thanks very much. I can't see anymore where they've gone. Okay. Thank you very much. I think you've raised very critical issues, both the gentlemen who spoke. One was on, increasing isolationism and protectionism, in an environment where there is a lot of distrust. And I think, Drew spoke so eloquently about how we are trying to build trust of the technical community to be able to continue functioning and doing our work. And I completely agree that there is a complete disconnect between this idea of digital sovereignty, which has become sort of the buzzword for a lot of nations to talk about, or rather to frame the way that they think about the internet and how they feel that citizens should use the internet. And that does rather disturb me, because a lot of the times where digital sovereignty is raised is often code word for something else, right? And I'll leave it to your imaginations what they mean when they say that. And I think that is, it goes against the idea of a borderless, internet where we celebrate permissionless innovation. And how do we sort of transmit these values from the technical community and bridge the gap of understanding from governments and nation states to understand why do we do work in this way and why is this important to us in making sure that the internet is global, it is single, it continues to be interoperable. So this is a lot of the work that we are continuing to do. And I'll use this to segue into the other gentleman who talked about, who is the champion of interdependency? It is not the technical community. I'm going to just put it right out there, right? We have spent many years talking about the values of the internet and why we have to maintain it as it is. And I think our voice is sort of dropped into a bucket of pool of water, and it, where does it go, right? So my answer to you is, it's very cliche, but I think the champions are us, all of us, collectively in the multi-stakeholder community, because we amplify each other's voices. The technical community can't always be, kind of raising the banner and, we keep talking and talking about the same things with the diplomats, with the governments, but if these messages are not carried across with other stakeholder groups, it becomes difficult. We are like the sole voice, just keep talking about this. So it is the responsibility of the multi-stakeholder community. I do strongly feel that we should demonstrate why we are this multi-stakeholder community and be able to, bolster each other this way.
Thanks, Joyce. I will take the remote question, I'll take Peter's question. So I don't know who wants to read it or if it was already addressed in the chat, just double check.
Sheetal or
Yeah,
Teresa
Sheetal,
will
Teresa.
read it out.
Yeah.
So if you can go to the remote moderators.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me just navigate to the question, which, okay. So the question is, most of global trade and transactions happens directly or indirectly through the internet. If there are barriers between geographies in a scenario of well-established internet barriers, do we go back to communication by post and telephones, or establish inter-regional treaties and bilateral treaties just to be able to send an email across geographies? So I suppose this is about what kind of legal regulatory solutions could we see? Is the solution in treaties or in something else, perhaps? Hopefully I've understood that and related it to you clearly.
Thanks, Sheetal. I'll take Peter's question as well, and then we can see who from our panelists would like to address them. So, Peter, you have the floor.
Okay, thanks, Bruna. This is Peter Koch. I work for DNIC, the German top-level domain registry, CCTLD. Following up on one of the previous speakers here at the microphone, and maybe also on Jen's response, somebody said that the notion of fragmentation is kind of losing a meaning. I'm wondering whether it is not the notion of internet that is confused here a bit. And maybe the panel can reflect on that a bit. I mean, this goes into the direction of the governance on and governance off. And when we were talking about the sovereignty, which is often control over content that reaches my population, where that line is, and whether there might be confusion actually what we mean, or what they mean when they say internet versus what the technical community means when we say what the internet is. Thank you.
Thank you. Any takers, commenters on the questions? Not sure, Marília, if you'd like to say something also about this, putting you on the spot, using the Brazilian privilege here.
Thank you, Bruna. I can take a couple of questions. Let me just say a few words about digital sovereignty before I move to Siva's question. I think that the association between digital sovereignty and isolationism and fragmentation is not necessarily true. One thing does not necessarily lead to the other. And if we see why discussions on digital sovereignty appeared in internet governance, they stem from the fact that we had more than a decade of liberal digital economy, which has made sure that the internet became global, which has lowered the prices of ICTs and services and brought us many benefits. But that has also brought us many flip sides, which were negative, such as the erosion of our rights online and more inequality in the context of digital economy. The promises that the digital economy would bring wealth to everybody were just not fulfilled. We had more concentration in the context of the digital economy. So in order to redress these imbalances, several countries have started to formulate requests for more autonomy to deal with trade-offs, policy trade-offs that were being created in the context of the internet. And I think that many of these requests for more autonomy and self-determination, they are legitimate. Whether they should be framed as digital sovereignty as a word or not is another story, but we ignore them for far too long. And I think that one thing does not necessarily lead to the other. We need to pay attention to countries and other actors who are formulating the need for more right and economic balance, whether this is through digital sovereignty or not. But let me go to the question of Siva, because I think it's a very interesting and provocative one. Because it is important to define fragmentation, but it's also important to try to define its flip side. So if we don't want fragmentation, what do we want to see? What is the internet that we want? Sometimes it's easier to fight for something that we want, right, than to try to defend ourselves from what we do not want to see. And I think a very good word to define this flip side is internet openness, which in the IGF has been understood as interoperability, as open standards, as flows of data packets, of content, and open governance. But openness is never a binary concept. We cannot have full closeness, we cannot have full openness. If we don't have no openness at all, the internet would collapse. And I think it's clear from different sectors that we do not want to go back to the telephone or to the telegraph, as Siva suggested. We need to have the internet because we depend on its value, economically, socially. So what are the solutions that we need to put in place in order to see an internet that does not fragment to the point in which it becomes useless to societies and to the economy? I think that a sad scenario that you mentioned, which seems more plausible than going back to the telephone, is to have regional internets. Not because there's a technical fragmentation, but because there is a market fragmentation. And this is happening already. If you live in Switzerland and you have a Huawei phone, you cannot update your phone fully anymore. I have friends who have been Huawei users for life because they just liked the phone, but they are thinking about switching. They don't have the freedom to use this hardware anymore because although it's built on an open source Android software, they cannot have updates being offered from Google anymore, and apps are not being offered to run on Huawei phones. So we are already fragmented in a way. Fragmentation from the standpoint of hardware, it has effects upstream. So we need to consider that as well when we are discussing fragmentation. And it's important to bring this aspect of how much we are fragmenting value chains to the picture.
Thank you, Marilia. I think we're seeing a lot of very concrete, right, different perspectives on the discussion, and it's very interesting that this session is diving into this because from one side you see as fragmentation, from the other side you see as sovereignty as possibly a positive thing that states might be able and might need to introduce at some point, but at the same time these sovereignty measures might result in different points and so on. But I'll hand it to Wim because I think we want to maybe dive into these more concrete aspects or concrete suggestions kind of areas, and just noting that maybe perhaps this differentiation between fragmentation and sovereignty can be one first thing that we start, or one first thing that the report this year can address. But I'll stop talking and give the floor back to you.
Thank you. As you can easily see, this is a very interesting discussion with a lot of facets, and I'm pretty sure we could fill a full IGF week just talking about internet fragmentation, hearing all views and opinions. But I would like to ask a very concrete question to each of the panelists, also the online panelists and the audience. Like I said, we work as intersessional activity usually we work in the months before the IGF, then the IGF is our endpoint. This year, it's thanks to the different scheduling, we have the opportunity to kick off most our work at the IGF with an interesting discussion and then work in the months after the IGF. The aim is that we have our report ready by the 1st of November. So a concrete question to each of the panelists, also the audience, for me is, what can we do? If you have one short discussion from this is something you can do in the next months and report on by the 1st of November, and this would be helpful for the discussion. So maybe let's start with Joyce.
They can also be hot takes if you want. So
I think moving forward, it might be useful for the PNIF to really look at some of the initiatives that have already begun or might be beginning that would address issues that are related to internet fragmentation. I think it would be quite hard to find specific initiatives that are tackling exactly the topic of internet fragmentation, but there is a lot of work that is going on around it, and I have already pointed out several of this sort of coordination that's happening. So if the report could perhaps put in some of the efforts that are already being done, I think that would really enrich your report.
Okay, thank you.
Before I see what next, I would just short mention that, especially coming from the government, what fragmentation means. One element that I didn't mention, that it affects totally transparency and justice system. So if we want strong institutions, we have to stop and really talk more about this, and especially supporting, because in my country and region we support a lot of startups. So if we want to continue supporting startups on digital network, we should talk about this. So what next? I think that we really, starting from the political level and more operational, should start working on gaps. I think that there are not too much gaps, but gaps exist. And of course, support more capacity building, but in local level. So people in local level understand how fragmentation can affect their everyday work, especially in digital plan. And of course, at the end, PNAF just continues its work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So what should we start to work on Monday?
Yes, from my point of view, I think what would be nice to also include, explain a little bit more what is the risk of internet fragmentation from the technical layer aspects, because especially when we see, as you said, it's such a broad term, that's why we came up with the framework, but the risk at the technical layer is, in my mind, is the highest, at least from where I sit. And that would have, I feel, the biggest impact. But that's not very clear to the other folks. Maybe the technical community understands this, but maybe we haven't articulated that well. So I hope that via this PNIR report, we can make that more clear, that why does the technical community at the technical layer focuses on fragmentation at that level so much, that why when the laws comes in and why sometimes they ask for conflicting things for the internet architecture itself, because it's not like the various governments have the same philosophies, they don't have the same requirement, but we have one internet, and we have to make sure that it remains one internet. And for that point, we need to articulate a little bit more better, and I hope we can partner on that and do something on this aspect.
Thank you. Let's move to the online panelists. Maria?
Thank you, Ben. I think that listening to discussions today, it becomes clear how the palette of topics that are encompassed under fragmentation are very diverse. And I think that this may be a little bit paralyzing. If I were to suggest something to the policy network, would be to prioritize which type of fragmentation the network wants to tackle in terms of topic in each work cycle. And the GDC talks about risks. I think this is a very important word. Perhaps it would be time to consult the IGF community with, I don't know, a questionnaire or something that they can reply to. Today, looking at the state of the world, which are the main risks being brought by fragmentation? Is it technical? Is it commercial? Is it censorship? And to focus on the work cycle on these particular risks. I think it would be easier like this to bring actors together, to identify them, and to have a discussion that becomes more focused and constructive, in which we can have concrete outcomes.
Thank you. And Michel, give us some concrete work to do.
Well, last word, I would say that we often oppose sovereignty and fragmentation. Maybe my own definition here, in Canada, where I'm from, people are talking about being sovereign. And being sovereign over the internet is completely technical. They would like that, our country depends less on other countries for its own infrastructure or its own data, for them to be, more controlled by us. So this is okay, and this is sovereignty. Now, fragmentation is totally political. Of course, we use the technical layer to make it happen, but it's totally political. Somebody somewhere decide that some user does not have access to some content. We need to understand that, and that discussion needs to be at a political level to make it not happening anymore.
Okay, thank you. Looking also at the audience, I would like to say, if you have ideas, very practical ideas of what we as Policy Network should do, I would recommend two things. First of all, subscribe to the mailing list of the Policy Network. You'll find details on the website. The second thing, if you have ideas, please contact me, please contact Bruna, Sheetal, or Teresa. We didn't hear her, but she was following our MAC co-facilitator. Just with ideas, we will be more than happy to hear. I see we have 4 minutes left, and I would like to go back to Sheetal, who has been following, taking notes, and will make a wrap-up of today's session. Back to you, Sheetal.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rim. I want to attempt to summarize the different areas of discussion by looking at 3 areas where I found there was some confluence, and it was interesting to hear all of the different perspectives to some extent coalesce around problems that we see when it comes to addressing internet fragmentation, examples of some good practice, and then recommendations, which you just ended on there by asking everyone for their recommendations for the PNIF. So those 3 areas, if we start with the problems that you discussed, we also obviously heard from remote and in-person participants on this. Some of the problems that were brought up were included still a lack of common understanding or the use of different terminologies when we're talking about this issue, but also increasing attempts at territorialization and the use of sovereignty concepts that have been really about strengthening the state itself, the entanglement of economic and national security, and the political normalization of network control. There was a discussion of the need to address that perhaps by bringing in discussions of or knowledge of the broader digital political economy. And so another problem, perhaps connected to that, is the disconnect between regulators and the technical community, a lack of understanding, perhaps between the different communities, misalignment and breakdown of coordination and cooperation between different stakeholder communities. Is also referenced, linking to that. There was also a lack of funding for actors who are working to address internet fragmentation and digital repression and distrust between different countries and communities. So considering all of that, there were also examples of good practice to address such problems. We heard about in Montenegro working to promote economic and political arrangements that align with the broader EU frameworks. We heard about, with the IAB, the development, of course, of global standards that promote interoperable data flows. We heard about the work of civil society and others to address digital repression by developing technical open source solutions. We heard about the RIR governance document, which is a really concrete example of setting out how cooperation can happen, what expectations are. And we heard about the Technical Community Coalition for Multi-Stakeholderism, which is an example of coordination and information sharing. So to end on recommendations and where we're going to launch the PNIF work, really, and invite you to continue to be part of this discussion. I think it was Joyce who mentioned that the IGF is a confidence and capacity building space, and so we want to continue to use that. There was recommendations that we develop more collaboration between the technical community and regulators and other stakeholders so that there's increased understanding of the impacts of regulation on the globality of the internet. It was suggested we consider discussion and connections to the political economy. So these discussions are not happening in a vacuum, but the broader trends there, mobilize companies perhaps as part of that. Perhaps we should focus in on a few risks to the global internet, identify other examples of successful coordination. So we had the TCCM, but other ones perhaps, that we seek ways to support actors and increase resourcing for addressing or figure out recommendations for increasing resourcing for addressing network control. that we engage with the WSIS plus 20 process and perhaps develop implementation recommendations for that cooperation commitment in the Global Digital Compact. So that, I'm just going to hand back to you now, and ending with that call for everyone to remain engaged in this discussion. We had so many recommendations there coming at the end about what we can practically do, and I look forward to working with you all together on taking those forward. Back to you, Wim.
Chantal, perfect timing. As we were saying, I'm going to wrap up. We just saw a time up come on the screen. So I would like to thank everyone for attending this session. Thank our panelists for this incredible discussion. And this is just the 20th IGF. We hope there's 40 more, 1,000 more. And we do look forward to continue engaging with you all with the PNIF perspective, but also as part of the IGF community. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
get started. Hello and good morning. I am very happy to see that there are still here people on Friday, so fantastic. And I'm very excited about our panel today. For those of you who don't know me yet, I think I've met many of the people here already, but I am Sabhana Zrishidia. I am with the TED Global Institute. We are a not-for-profit that focuses on Global South, digital rights, and policy issues, and I'm very excited to be moderating this panel and being joined by a fantastic set of panelists, both in person and online. We have about 90 minutes together, and we're going to divide this time up with some conversations with the panelists, as well as an opportunity for the audience here, as well as online, to ask us some questions. So on that note, maybe I can start by introducing our panelists, and then moving on to kind of talking a little bit more about the discussion topic today, which is something that's top of mind for all of us, which is digital public infrastructure, a topic that has been actually started by the Indian presidency of the G20 and has really moved on from there through Brazil and now South Africa, is now also a major topic of the Freedom Online Coalition, which is where we are. I'm an advisory network member. A number of other global processes where DPI is increasingly coming up, whether that's the GDC, whether that is to some of the work from UNDP and a number of other sort of UN bodies and UN processes. So this is an important topic, especially for those of us who are in the global majority. And I'm sure many of our panelists will have lots to say about that as well. So on that note, I am going to start with some of my panelists here. From the extreme left of me is Rasmus Lumi, who is the Director General of the Department of International Organizations and Human Rights at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Estonia. Then we have Luca Belli, who is a professor at FGV Law School, Rio de Janeiro, and Director of the Center for Technology and Society. We then have Smriti Parshira, Research Fellow at the Interledger Foundation, who is also co-convening this panel with the Freedom Online Coalition. We then have Shiobhadra Singh, who is the Principal Advisor for the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India. That's our in-person panelists, and online we're being joined by Mr. Armando Manzueta, who is the Vice Minister for Public Innovation and Technology at the Ministry of Public Administration of the Dominican Republic, Keith Breckenridge, who is the Standard Bank Chair in African Trust Infrastructures at the University of Witwatersrand, South Africa. I feel like I butchered that name, but hopefully Keith will correct me. As well as Vidisha Chaudhary, who's the Assistant Professor of Government, Information Cultures and Digital Citizenship at the University of Amsterdam. So a star-studded panel, as we say, but I'll probably get started on us. As I was saying that digital public infrastructure, and I was actually just in a panel right before, where we also quite talked about, how do we think about DPI, not just within the context of specific processes, but perhaps all processes. And we're discussing that in the context of the G7 presidency as well, where it hasn't really come up as much as a priority, but there's real opportunity for that, particularly because this is such an important issue for the global majority. But oftentimes, as we think about digital public infrastructure, there's a bit of a tension, because in many ways, this is a technology that's deeply national in many ways, right? Because it is about building for your national citizen databases, looking into various national processes, and really strengthening the role of the public sector in delivering services and opportunities for its citizens. But increasingly, these national processes are also becoming, because of they're part of these global dialogues and global sort of conversations right now, there is an increasing need to find a common language around DPI. DPIs can be of many shapes, forms. We still are lacking a very universal definition of DPI. I think we are maybe at the tail end of that debate now, which is great. But that was a major issue of discussion for several years. But because so many countries are finding their own adoption models, thinking through their own public infrastructures, there is increasingly a need for thinking, what is the universal element of it? Are there certain principles that ties DPS across different kinds of countries? How do you think about governance in this space? And are these governance sort of approaches cross-border? Should they be cross-border? Can they be cross-border? And what are some of the political contexts, the social context driving DPI? Because we want, while we want DPIs to be interoperable within national boundaries, we also want them to have some level of interoperability within international borders as well, because the whole point is to really tackle the data fragmentation problem, tackle some of the e-gov fragmentation problems. So there's a lot of promise there. So those are some of the, I guess, topics that I hope we'll be discussing today, but that's sort of the context and backdrop within which that we're I'm having this conversation. I would also like to flag that as part of the Freedom Online Coalition, Estonia has been, during their chairship, leading on the rights respecting DPI principles effort as well, that Rasmus will speak about, which is also one way of really helping us think through those universal principles. So on that note, maybe I will start with Luca, actually, who's here with us today. Maybe share a little bit more about, what do you think are some of the social, political, economic incentives driving DPI adoption in countries? And perhaps, what are some of the considerations that governments and other stakeholders should be having when they're thinking about implementing DPI?
Thank you very much for inviting me here and for organizing this very timely discussion. And let me also clarify that most of the thoughts I'm going to share are the result of our empirical research in one of our flagship projects at the center, which is called Cyber BRICS, that analyzes the digital policies of the BRICS grouping. And so we have been analyzing data governance, cybersecurity, digital transformation, and AI governance over the past 7 years in the various phases. And a parallel theme that has emerged is the theme of digital sovereignty, which is what has led us to analyze even more in-depth DPIs. And let me tell you why. So we have recently published a book, which is online in open access on the site of the editor, Cambridge University Press, on digital sovereignty in the BRICS. And by analyzing how the BRICS grouping have shaped the narrative, the initiative on digital sovereignty, you immediately understand that there is an ample spectrum of initiatives. Some of them are those initiatives that we analyze, but we do not recommend to reproduce, that flirt with authoritarianism or protectionism. Some others are some very interesting initiatives that I define as good digital sovereignty, that basically utilize the construction of technology to foster competition, to foster domestic innovation, and to empower people. And one of the very good examples of this is a digital public infrastructure we use in Brazil for online payments, PIX. I'm not sure if everyone knows it, but the Brazilian Central Bank has implemented since 2020 this digital public infrastructure, and why this is a very good example of good digital sovereignty, and why this is something that automatically triggers, from our experience, user empowerment, innovation, and competition, and also taxation of the innovation that is developed domestically. Before the PIX in Brazil, the only way we had in Brazil to perform electronic payments was through Visa and MasterCard. So we were totally dependent on a duopoly, two companies that are foreign companies, nothing against, I have literally zero against them, but they charge between 3 and 5% for every transaction. So in every country, the consumers pay 3 to 5%, the economy transfers 3 to 5% of each transaction to Visa and MasterCard, if you are dependent on them. So since the Brazilian Central Bank that has developed the PIX with a multi-stakeholder effort with dialogue with specialists and also with banks and financial intermediaries, and also implements it through a multi-stakeholder process, because there is something called the PIX Forum, where all the implementers, the financial sector representatives can participate and explain what are the problems and how they are innovating through this. So since this has been implemented, not only the duopoly has been broken, which is something that we should really celebrate, and our antitrust authority, through conventional means, would have never been able to do this. The duopoly has been broken by creating an alternative, and that is extremely powerful. And the result is not only that this has automatically reverted in the pockets of cost of customers 3 to 5%, which is already something stellar, but also that this has distributed data collection. So people do not realize that over the past 10 years, Visa and MasterCard have become big data companies. So the main part of their revenue is not the 3 to 5% they collect per transaction, is the data they collect and they process, and thanks to which they generate AI and new services that usually also is the intellectual property of which is usually then delocalized to fiscal heavens like the Cayman Islands and the Virgin Islands. So what is interesting here is not only that the customer welfare is increased, but also that the competition is automatically enhanced, innovation is produced, and data governance is distributed. And the local entrepreneurs that innovate thanks to this, then they have to pay taxes in Brazil. So we have a very different dynamic here of empowerment through DPIs. So that is why we really see this as an incredible example of good digital sovereignty that actually Brazil has to some extent copied from India. India has UPI, and actually it's an untold story that we recount in our book that India to some extent took inspiration from Russia, another BRICS country that in 2014, after he invaded for the first time Ukraine, annexing Crimea, was blocked from the first sanction was the blockage of Visa and MasterCard. From overnight, they had to create a new system. It's called Mir, like the space station, but it is based on a card. So it's a very 20th century conception of it. The great innovation of the Indians has been leveraging their skills and do it a software-based digital public infrastructure. And I think to some extent, Brazil has enhanced it, because if you look at the Indian example, that is something that, in our observation, makes it much easier to implement DPIs, so to delegate them to the implementation, at least, to a non-public stakeholder. In India is the National Payment Corporation of India, which is a foundation, which is much more agile in implementing things than bureaucracies, and everyone knows the limits of government and bureaucracy in this sense. But I think that what is the problem here is that if you want to file a freedom of access to information in India, so let's say that you're a user and you want to know which data it's collected about you and which are the data security measures implemented, they can reply to you, well, we are sorry, this is not a public organ, this is a foundation, so we are not bound by freedom of access to information. And I think that this could be easily improved in India, but so far I have this criticism, the only criticism I actually have on the UPI in India. In Brazil, this has been improved because it is it's a truly public service. It's not something public only because it is publicly accessible. It's public because it's the government that delivers it. And so if I file a freedom of access to information request to the Brazilian Central Bank, they have to reply me. Otherwise, I sue them. And they have to, at that point, they will have to reply me. So if I, as a Brazilian citizen, I want to know which kind of data are collected and what are the measures, they need to tell me. So it's much more performing in terms of accountability. So I think that for all these reasons, I think that there is a lot of room for considering DPI as something very good for digital sovereignty, for good digital sovereignty, but also there are some limits, and so we should not praise them as if it was a religion, but be very pragmatic and analyze the fact. Thank you.
Thanks, Luca. That was very helpful. And I think perhaps that's where I would love to kind of bring in Keith from online. In terms of, Luca talked about a little bit about sort of, both the promise of DPI, but also the pragmatism associated with it, and the fact that, there's a very positive example for Brazil, but I know from your research in South Africa, there has also been a different set of results. So I'm curious, Keith, if you could share a little bit more about what your experience has been from the old age of IDs, digital IDs, and now, the new shiny DPI, what some of those learnings and experiences has been from South Africa, and perhaps what are some of the political and socioeconomic contexts within which DPIs are existing in the global majority.
Thank you. Yeah, it is very interesting. Thanks very much for the invitation. So DPI has come to South Africa through the G20 and the Gates Foundation and Operation Vulindlela. It's coming in from the top of the bureaucracy. But many of the things that people think about as being kind of benefits of DPI have existed in South Africa for a long time, as they have in other places. I'm not suggesting we're the only ones who've had that. So we've had a digital system for welfare distribution since the early 1990s, in fact, a little bit older than that, and a biometric population register that covers everybody, at least, you can say it's been in place for about 20 years. And both of these things interact with the payment system. They do not work in real time. There are all sorts of kind of clunky bits and pieces of it that don't work well. I will say DPI is a big improvement on the plan that was in place in South Africa 3 or 4 years ago, which was one aimed at moving the population register into the security cluster. So it was all about basically targeting people who were in the officials' minds were illegally in South Africa. So migrants in particular were going to be hunted down using high-resolution ID photographs and a CCTV network. All of this done with the support of the contracting companies. I won't name them here, but they were selling that as a kind of resource to the bureaucracy. So DPI, comparatively, wonderful. I mean, it's a much better system, much better plan. And I think there are lots of things that DPI can do that would be excellent. In the plans, at least, especially the UPI plans, we see space for enabling intermediaries, for example, letting people act as what we would call fiduciaries. And there's possibility to build that out so that, in fact, it's not a question of very under-equipped poor people confronting a powerful state and not being able to get any answers or remedies at the moment. But the big kind of takeaway benefit that people keep pushing for DPI, which is really about access and financial inclusion, I mean, those things have been in place in South Africa for a long time, for generations. There's no big payoff in that area. I'm really skeptical that there are benefits for poor people of real-time settlement. I think there's actually this risk there. I don't think it's a benefit. And I think we really have to ask some hard questions about financial inclusion. I'm sorry, I can see, I mean, I do understand. If you look at my work, you'll see a lot of benefits to this, but we have to ask what's happening now. And financial inclusion is not doing what people promise for it. It is, again, something that we've seen for a while. We're at least a decade into mass financial inclusion. It's encouraging usurious lending. There's no asset creation. People are borrowing at 1% a day. And they're being kind of pushed into a blacklisting engine that says if you don't pay, we're going to block you out of ever accessing the formal credit system. The biggest problem in South Africa people don't want to talk about is online gambling. So now people accessing the payment system using the gambling apps. It's just truly astonishing. 1 trillion rand was spent on online gambling systems in 2023. That's a third of GDP. 1/3 of GDP spent on gambling, and the tax collector is kind of complicit in this process because they take a big chunk of that and put it into, so it's like a hidden digital tax. And there are lots of risks for families here too that people, well, but people don't want to talk about it while we're talking about designing a more and more expansive system to make people visible on these networks. So there's back-end hacking, people breaking into, this happens in South Africa. I've yet to see what it looks like anywhere else. So when people break in, they steal the encryption codes and they can essentially help themselves to people's online accounts. Lots of examples of that. We have lots of examples, as everybody else does, of what we call pig butchering, people being kind of seduced into giving away their money to sometimes members of the family, but sometimes people they meet online. And all of that worry, that kind of fear of the dangers of moving the poor into the payment system was before the Trump administration, right? Which has now seen a wholesale withdrawal from the regulatory state. And you know what this looks like. I'm not going to repeat it, but the key institutions, the SEC, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and probably more important than anything else for us was this Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which made companies that behave badly literally hand themselves into the Department of Justice in the United States. And that's a wide range. There are dozens of companies that did this, including some famous examples from Brazil. And that kind of regulatory, what everyone calls it, context, is disappeared. All right, so if we don't ignore all of these problems, what should we be doing? That's, I suppose, the question. And the fundamental issue really has to be making the what we could call metrics of exclusion much more visible. So while we're talking about DPI, what happens with DPI is we make credit scores visible. That's the big driver. So companies can now build either their own system or they can share data, and it puts individuals in a, truthfully, I'm not sure they're the beneficiaries of this. I'm not sure that financial inclusion, there's not much evidence. There's a lot of good evidence that, in fact, the overwhelming effect of a kind of mass digital lending system is actually increasing poverty. It's not fixing the problem. So exclusion and metrics and publishing that. There should be immediately on the website, it should be, this is the number of people whose identity numbers are at the moment disabled. And this is how long it's taking for us to basically answer queries around those numbers. I can tell you what this looks like in South Africa. There was a court case last year in January where the Department of Home Affairs admitted that 2 million identity numbers had been turned off. Now, turning off in our current system just involves editing literally a comment field on the third page of the population register, and that disables the identity number from functioning. It means you cannot access, can't register the birth of your child, can't bury your parents, can't access a bank account, you cannot function digitally. All these Estonian, the capacities people like to talk about, they're very easily switched off in the current system, and that needs to be much more carefully regulated. So officials who edit the population register, they need to be subject to exactly the same kind of oversight as the people who are being essentially identified by it. So, and then I'd say the third big issue is making space for what we could call trusted fiduciaries. I think it has to be more than lawyers. These have to be officials almost, or semi-private officials who are self-regulated in the first instance, who can interact with this DPI engine. The nicest example of how this actually works in South Africa are the undertakers. So that, we have excellent death registration and very quick, well-handled death documentation, that when someone dies, they get very quickly documented. And the reason is that undertakers earn a fortune from putting bodies in the ground, and they've been granted access to the population register in order to speed up that whole process. But we need something like that that helps when you go to get an identity document and you see that the population register has misspelled your name, mischaracterized your gender, there are so many mistakes. Once you've lived with a big, powerful system like we have for generations, the errors they sort of lurk in the databases. And as soon as you build a nice, clever, joined up, interoperable system, you begin to see the dangers of that for all sorts of things. You now can't access healthcare because you somehow fallen foul of a maternity suit or paternity suit in another area of the state's databases.
Thanks, Keith. I think those are some interesting food of thought for us. And I think lots for also the panel, for us, I will definitely come back to you with some questions. Maybe I'll try and turn to Sriti now in terms of, I think, Luca and Keith gave very different starting points for DPI in terms of, what the political, social, legacy set of context was in that space. And I'm curious, and I think some of the points that were raised really was around sovereignty, around security and governance, around transparency, access to data in order to kind of build robust systems. So I'm curious from your research and your experience, what do you think are some of the prerequisites as far as regulation and governance is concerned to really build a people-centered DPI?
Thanks, Dia. Such a pleasure to be a part of such a stellar panel. Let me just begin by introducing, the organization I'm with, Interledger Foundation, in case people don't know of them. It's a nonprofit that works on financial inclusion and open payments, but I should caveat the views I'm expressing here are my own as a researcher and civil society participant from India. And I'm going to try and address that and also speak to some of the points that were made earlier by, first saying what is the good of the moment that we are in, this momentum that we are seeing around DPI. As Keith said, not all of it is new, not all these interventions are new. But what is new is the firepower that's going behind it from the highest levels, right? The countries, but also at the level of UN, thinking about safeguards, thinking about a push for openness, inclusivity, and all of that is fantastic. I think that's, a good direction to be going in. But I want to, add some observations around, what could be done better. And I think the first thing I want to bring in is, if you think about the participants in this ecosystem broadly, for the state, the markets, the civil society, and the actual public, who is the, the beneficiary ultimately of, supposed to be the beneficiary of, all of these developments. And there is this very strong state-market alliance that we are seeing, both in terms of the implementation of DPI, in terms of how it's being developed, how it's being rolled out, but also in terms of the philosophy behind DPI, right? So if in the Indian context, we often see the entities which are developing DPI being called as a startup in the government, right? So there is this valorization of the idea of startup, of the idea of markets. Aadhaar, which is our digital ID program, has been called as a poverty killer app. So a lot of phrases, a lot of thinking philosophy coming from this idea, valorization of the way the Silicon Valley has developed. But also, as Lucas said, it's a counter to the way Silicon Valley has developed and proliferated in all over the global south in particular. So DPI is in that sense both a counter but also runs the risk of following some of that same playbook. And I think that's the first thing we need to be a little worried about. And in my work, I to use this concept of an alt big tech. So in the process of being a pushback against big tech, could we be creating another ecosystem which is pursuing scale in the same reckless manner, which is really blind to due process, really blind to other things in the pursuit of reaching scale fast? So I think those are things to be conscious about in the DPI story. The second thing I want to focus on is when we talk about the public in DPI, there are many interpretations, as Lucas said. Is it public in terms of ownership? Is it public in terms of the deployment landscape? But I think the really important question is it public in terms of the participation? And there again, the question is, when we are thinking about the global south context, very often we are in ecosystems where things like regulatory impact assessment, cost-benefit analysis are not part of the day-to-day culture. And there are exceptions like the TRAI in India, which has this very robust culture of transparency and accountability in its regulation-making process. But that's unfortunately not something which trickles down to all agencies, and it's certainly not something we've seen in the deployment of the DPI process. So it has been very much a top-down sort of approach, and that's something to think about. The linked point of that is really, the role of civil society in all of this. And I think the fundamental question of who is civil society, right? Usually you think of civil society by definition as something which is, separate from the state and markets. It's a voluntary association of people who assemble around certain values, but those values could be very different. The values could be about, that the route for empowerment is through market-based mechanism, and that's one value. Or the value could be that you need to push for more human rights and think about, that's another value. And I think it's open for debate which value is better than the other, but it is important to have space for both these values reflected in the platform. And sometimes it does happen that, certain allied values find a space in internal debates, but values which are not aligned either have to resort to the media or have to resort to courts to find a voice. So I think that's an important conversation to shift that and really bring in some, first principles, accountability, participation. And the final point I want to make from the Indian experience, I think I've been a bit dull and negative in what I've said, but I want to bring in a point about the value of social construction. Right, so much of what we are thinking about DPI from different perspectives is about techno-determinism. There are some people who think like this is the path to, to kind of empowerment, to inclusion. There are some people who think this is the path, a sure path to a decline in human rights. But there is a counter view that there is a process of social construction that is happening in the DPI deployment. I'll give the example of Aadhaar in the Indian context. So when it was first deployed, the idea from the agencies was that this would just be a number, this would not be a card, right? But when society accepted it, they said, we actually need a card. We are used to a card as a form of identity. And, over time, the way it was accepted by society and by the authority was that now it is accepted as a form of card. Similarly, several other features like, initially, whenever you would use your Aadhaar, you would use those digits and, that particular number. But over time, a virtual version of it has emerged as a part of the pushback, as a part of the questions by, before the court. The idea that, can you have a masked ID where instead of revealing your main ID everywhere, you just reveal this virtual ID. So there has been positive social construction which has taken place. But again, coming back to the question of participation, very often, these are brought as new mechanisms, but because they're not originating from the agency itself, they're coming back as a, as a pushback, as a way to accommodate. Sometimes they don't become the mainstream solution. And I think that's where we need to go in terms of DPI and recognizing that there is a lot of, just from experience from your own country, from each other's country. So as others do, digital ID, I think it would be valuable to look at the default as virtual ID as opposed to the main ID to learn from each other's experience. And I think that would be a positive way to proceed with DPI.
Thanks, Metis. Lots of little nuggets for me to pick up on later. Maybe I'm going to now turn to Bidisha as you're coming online. And I think I want to double click on the question of ownership. I think we just heard different takes on it, in terms of what Brazil's experience has been in terms of, these being owned by truly public agencies, and therefore the Right to Information Act and FOIA's kind of play in that space. We are hearing sort of a mixed bag of reactions in terms of DPIs elsewhere, where maybe the public agency is not fully in terms, or fully present in terms of the ownership of the system. And I think just to build on that, DPIs are also highly modular systems, right? It's not just one big technology. There's multiple parts to it, multiple stakeholders at play. And to Smriti's point, really this conversion from, are we actually creating another monopoly in order to tackle, sort of the existing monopoly, right? So how do we think about monopolization and ownership in this space as well? So I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more to that in terms of, your research, how you're thinking about how do we truly make DPI a public interest technology and a public-facing technology, and how should policymakers, civil society, and other stakeholders be thinking about ownership within the DPI architecture?
Thank you, Dia, and thank you everyone for, I think they've all made excellent points. I don't know how much new things I can add to the points that have already been made. But just to respond to the question of ownership and publicness in DPI, I want to underline, at least in the Indian context, the role, very important role of the state in conceptualizing and implementing DPI. And not just building on Aadhaar, but if you look at UPI and then other efforts, even though there has been very, very close partnership between the state and the market, which is also not new in the Indian context and elsewhere, state-market partnership has always been there. But particularly in case of DPIs, I think there are three specific roles that the Indian state has played. And they have been very clear in owning this DPI up, even though there has been considerable amount of effort by, I would say, the software industry partnership in India. And I see these three roles as creating an institutional space, like even the creation of NPCI to, push forward the agenda of financial innovation or digitalization of financial products. The state and the RBI has played a very important role in creating that kind of an institutional space where the DPI-like innovation can take place. The second has been in implementation of DPIs or pushing for implementation of DPI and specifically scaling this up, came through very, very clear state policy. So Aadhaar was mandated for all welfare, right? So this cannot happen. This kind of scale cannot be achieved without the intervention of the state. The same we see for UPI, that all, the fact that all welfare accounts needs to be connected to a mobile phone number and a zero balance bank account. That created that whole scale of public who will now be the market for financial innovation or digital financial inclusion. So here the state played very important role for scaling up DPI or even creating the possibility of scaling up something like an UPI. And the other role that the state plays is regulatory role, that how to regulate this multi-stakeholder ecosystem that we have, how to regulate each of these stakeholders. But having said that, so I think in the case of India, the state has been very much there in terms of subsidizing the infrastructure on which these are built, in regulating these infrastructural spaces and stakeholder, and also scaling up this infrastructure to much of the Indian population, let's say. But I think the word of caution that I would just put here, that while the state does play an important role, and I think that should play an important role, especially in a global majority, where the role of the state in bringing in development, bringing in inclusion is more, should be more explicitly realized. But the caution here, I'll just take the example of UPI in this case. So one of the things that came out of our research is that when the state is regulating and when you are relying on a very, very global digital infrastructure or global digital platform, there is already very, very big players. So I understand that DPI is kind of thought as an alternative to big tech, this question of digital sovereignty. But to what extent the big tech can, you can create an alternative infrastructure, and I mean the software and the technological infrastructure, which is truly independent of the big tech, is something we need to really explore and ask more carefully. For example, one of the things that came up in our study of UPI in India is that even though it is seen as something which is owned by the state, to some extent subsidized by the state, scaled by the state, the major traffic that controls the UPI ecosystem, or at least the volume of transaction, is GPay. So much so that many of the vendors, small-scale vendors that we interview, they don't even think of UPI as a public infrastructure. They kind of synonymously think of it as a Google infrastructure. So, even without knowing much about it, because that's what they use constantly, like GPay, PhonePe is a Walmart subsidiary. So they call this infrastructure as GPay or as PhonePe. So they don't even think of it as an UPI, which is owned by the state, or maybe not owned by, maintained and sustained by the state. So I think that is where it becomes very critical to understand or even explore that how do we actually circumvent the influence of the big tech when we rely on an infrastructure where the big tech interests are so much more embedded already. I think so that's a cautionary tale with which I will stop.
Thanks, Vidisha. I think we've heard quite a bit from our non-state stakeholders, if I may, as the term of the multilateral space goes. In terms of the various iterations of DPI, questions around ownership, questions around sovereignty, some positive, some sort of cautionary tales. So it's been quite a mixed bag, and I think that's really great because I think it starts demonstrating that not all DPI is the same. It is supposed to be different, and it isn't this monolithic technology that just gets replicated around the world. And I think that's a really important piece of that puzzle. But I will now turn to our government stakeholders, perhaps, in terms of, you've heard quite a bit from the various panelists here, and maybe I'll start with you, Mr. Singh, in terms of, India has come up quite a bit in this conversation, as it should. I think India has been such a leader in the DPI space in terms of really setting that mark, demonstrating how it's possible for a global majority country to pull something like this together. And a very deliberate role of the state in terms of tackling issues of inclusion, of whether it's financial inclusion, whether it is identity inclusion, whether it is socioeconomic inclusion. There's been multiple layers of that. But we've also heard these concerns around ownership, these questions around what is really the role of the state, how does the state work with the broader software ecosystem, and perhaps what are some of the regulatory considerations as the state thinks about scaling this technology. So maybe I'll turn to you to kind of respond a bit to that. And just one add-on to that question is I know, while the DPI infrastructure is a very national, domestic play, India has also been leading in kind of making it global, right? So I'm curious also, as you're thinking through your response, how does India see sort of its learnings nationally play out in terms of the global scaling of the technology, and particularly some of the principles that it carries forward?
Thank you, dear. I would just like to start with the problem statement, what actually we are looking at to solve. Because a lot of the times we go directly to the issues related to privacy and secrecy and all the things. But the problem, and particularly in India, what we were actually looking at is a large section of population which was not having access to the public services. So this was the main driving theme. And when we embarked on this journey of DPI, I think most of us were not aware that this will be named as DPI at all. So because Aadhaar came back way back in, I think, 2009, 2010. And that actually laid the foundation of the present day DPI is what we are having. So the basic requirement to give public services to the down the pyramid to everybody, access to the public services, was the basic requirement through which this journey started. And once we had the Aadhaar digital identity, and in the present case, we already almost 1.33 billion Indians are having the Aadhaar digital identity. And that forms the basis of all our services which are extended to. And once these services are available, it is being used by not only those who were earlier not basically accessing these services, it is being used by it has become a citizen-centric services now. So when we embarked, now we are a lot of, in the world, it is being discussed actually what DPI is and what should be the foundational principles of these DPI has to be. But as far as we are concerned, we have our own foundational principles when we embarked our journey. And let me say that as we negotiate, as we travel, as we implement, as we learn, we always have some aspects which we change and introduce in our systems. So nothing becomes, you can say that it is not like things being cast in stone. Based on our experiences, there has been some judicial pronouncements also. And based on those, we make changes in our systems and we try to be transparent. So the basic principles which we actually have in our systems, I would just like to go through, maybe in case of taking the risk of repetition also, that we have certain principles like eliminate economic, technical, and social barriers. Then the system has to be modular and scalable. Key privacy-enhancing technologies and security features within the core design to ensure individual privacy, data protection, and resilience based on standards. And then we have laws, regulations, and policies should ensure that these systems are transparently governed and promote competition. So these are the basic principles through which we have been building our DPIs. The government has been the major source of inspiration, major source of finance also in these cases. But I'll not say that it is basically driven by government. There are a lot of individuals, lot of organizations who are participating and helping us build the DPIs. Now, once we have this DPIs in place, I just wanted, because we have an experience of already implementing and achieving the scale, which we can showcase to the world at large. And what are the changes it actually makes to the society? I'd just like to give some details of that. But before that, once the Aadhaar was in place, digital identity was in place, we had a challenge of how to provide a financial inclusion to the large section of the society. Most of the Indians, maybe about 10 years back, they were not having bank accounts also. Mm-hmm. So we went through this digital identity of Aadhaar, and in India, we open an account maybe in less than half a minute. The KYC is being done through Aadhaar, and account is opened, and that account gets mostly operated through a mobile. So there was in parallel, the 4G was being implemented all over India, mobile phones, and the broadband was actually proliferating at a very fast pace. And digital identity people got, the accounts were being opened, and in the Jan Dhan account, what we call, is the zero balance account which is being opened. The present count is 550 million. So this is the number. So these people who are basically out of any financial inclusion, they got a platform. They got, it is just a mind-boggling figures which I am actually quoting. And so many people were out of the banking system. And just because we had these DPIs, we had these platforms, the financial inclusion of large proportion of our population actually happened. Once they were part of the banking system, there were a lot of benefits government was giving, which came to their accounts. Money was getting transferred to their accounts. Right from building toilets in the villages to building houses in the villages, and pensions were being given. So the experience of India was not very good in giving these benefits to the people, because a lot of the proportion of it was being siphoned off. So the direct benefit transfer actually came into being. And then UPI happened. UPI happened much at a later date, while we had an Aadhaar identity. We had this Jan Dhan account. And what UPI did was that the transaction through the mobile bank happened at a very fast pace. So people adopted, they had an account, so they were able to transact. So these things actually happened, and now, in fact, the last month of, I am having the details, 18.77 billion transactions were $290 billion. That is only for the month of 2025. So the adoption of UPI has been so fast because we had a system of accounts, we had a system of digital identity already in place. And then now India is actually building upon all these advantages. There are 3 or 4 examples which I just need to quote to give it, the context to our audiences today. That we have a GEM, that is Government E-Market Place, where most of you may be aware that the state, federal, and the state governments is one of the biggest procurement of services and goods. In our case, there has been a DPI built on that, which we call GEM, and the facilities of procurement of goods and services to all the state governments and the federal government actually happens through that. And if I just give the figures, there are 11,000 products, 336 services, 1,64,000 buyers, and for last year, that is from the April of 2024 to March of 2025, there was a procurement of $625 billion through that. So, and what has happened is, actually, before that, there was a small group of suppliers. They had actually controlled the market of procurement, the government was procuring through them. It has basically democratized the suppliers. It has enabled a person sitting in a village, a person sitting there in the remote part of the country to become a supplier to the government. This is how actually the transition is happening. Then I don't know how many of you would be aware of open network of digital commerce, ONDC, which is being implemented. We have seen actually the platforms which are basically which provide e-commerce have not been very democratic in nature. There are issues with small and medium enterprises to actually come on board on them. So this ONDC also is being made for actually, it doesn't actually stops at, or it doesn't say that larger ones cannot come to our platform, but it actually enables small and medium enterprises to actually, it enables them to participate in the e-commerce activity. We have in fact, a very popular Ayushman Bharat scheme, what we call, where this health benefits are being given to the common public, and the number is also, I will just like to quote, is 787 million. And there are 409,000 health facilities which have been registered, and 648,000, that is 648,000 health professionals. So what it has done, that you have an Ayushman Bharat card, you want to avail the facilities of the hospital. Hospitals are registered by the government. health professionals are registered by the government. You go to all these hospitals which are on board, show your card, give your number, and you get the facilities, and the payment is done through, the government does the payment for that. And this is all seamless, cashless. This is basically the basic facilities being extended to a common citizen. And earlier, if you just imagine the numbers and imagine whether it can be done without a DPI in place, the answer is absolutely no. So in India, we had no option. If we have to, the time was very short, services to be provided to the citizens was a large number of services. Whether we could have done it without DPI, the answer is no. Whether we could have waited for the definitions to be finalized, the answer is no. We have embarked on our journey. We have achieved a lot. We still learn and we implement as per our experiences and based on there is another aspect, in fact, in our G20 presidency. We had included this DPI as one of the pillars, and it was accepted with certain changes which was made during the negotiations. And I think that was the time when the world actually woke up to the DPIs and started discussing about them, although a lot of things were happening at other places, but now it is the time for all of us to sit together and to see that there has been a lot of experiences in other places also, how we can learn from them. And as far as India is concerned, we have offered free of cost to any country which wants to adopt DPI platform. Our Prime Minister has offered this during the G20 presidency, and it can be adopted by any country, and we'll be very happy to actually help that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think quite a bit of background from what India's sort of problem statement was and how it kind of approached that larger ecosystem. And I think one of the things that was also interesting, I think India's G20 presidency also came right after the pandemic, when the world also felt that if governments could not deliver public services, and we were in a situation where physical infrastructures were no longer functional, then this was really the way forward. So I think many things kind of tied together and really helped propel and DPI into the spotlight. I'm going to turn to Armando, who has joined us online from the Dominican Republic. And it was very interesting to hear from Mr. Singh in terms of what India's sort of problem statement was, what was really trying to solve, and sort of the long journey it went through in terms of various iterations of what we now today know as DPI. I'm curious, Armando, you're leading a lot of the innovation that's happening in the Dominican Republic in terms of reimagining government services, reimagining public to citizen relationships, and how do we sort of rethink digital transformation? So maybe you could share a bit more about what your experiences has been in the DPI space, and also just building on the previous question, how is sort of the national priorities tying up to the more universal principles around DPI, and how is sort of Dominican Republic adopting some of those?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this amazing panel. The conversation has been very rich, and I'm more than eager to share a bit of the work that we're doing so far in the DR. For the Dominican Republic, the DPI as a concept is something that is fairly new. We basically started back in 2020 when we were thinking about how to solve societal level problems that are tied to public services, especially when it comes to data interoperability and identity and, of course, payments. So in that regard, for us, DPI is not just a set of technologies, but a nation-building tool, and one that must be grounded in rights, resilience, and trust. In that regard, basically, there are two realities that are driving our adoption on that front, which is socially, since we're responding to citizen demands for accessible and inclusive services that respect their dignity and privacy. Politically, in the sense that DPI enables a more transparent, participatory, and result-oriented government, and a state, of course. And economically, because for us, it's a letter for inclusion that is also unlocking opportunities for not just for the people on their feet, but also for small businesses, youth, women, and especially people that are in underserved areas. We realized that we can only fulfill our promise to the people when the foundations are right. And for us, that means like doing a major groundwork for having a strong legal and regulatory frameworks around data protection, interoperability, and open standards. For us to keep strengthening institutions that ensure oversight and safeguard implementation, and of course, having institutions that are involved, especially from the third sector, the civil society, private sector, that one way or another has some sort of shared responsibility on insight and oversight of the work the government is doing on that front. So from the very beginning, we started first with the most tackling issue for us, which is data interoperability. So we decided to build our own infrastructure on data exchange based on the work that the government of Estonia has done before on implementing this broad open source platform called X-Road for data exchange. We did local customization and implementation, and we are basically translating all the documentation into Spanish for institutions and eventually the private sector to understand how it works and get on board on that. Since we started implementing it in 2021, 2022, we roughly have around 71, 72 institutions that are currently using the X-Road ecosystem for data exchange. And the result has been very interesting so far. But we face now another issue, which is, of course, data governance. And now we're rethinking on how data governance actually works, not just for public services provision, but also how we can empower people on that front. And in that sense, we're working on a new set of regulations around that principle. One that is focused not just on the data protection itself, but also on the quality of the data that is actually being exchanged. So we're working on defining proper data observability and orchestration mechanisms, so we can actually make some of the principles around data protection something that should be easy enforceable, because sometimes these concepts can be very abstract and very difficult to grasp by institutions or to more personalize on a technical level. So in that front, defining this proper set of data rules and having the right platforms alongside the data exchange mechanism for it's important, especially for them to be secure and to respect people's rights on that front. And of course, having a way for these oversight mechanisms that should be implemented from the civil society so they can keep the government accountable on the work that it's doing on that front. When it comes for identity, basically what we started doing, since the government in the Dominican Republic has the peculiar characteristic that it doesn't administrate directly the civil registry, although it's a public institution, but it's outside of the government. We have made several workarounds based on the work that we previously have done with data exchange. So what we decided was to build some sort of authentication platform starting for public services that builds on the same principles of data protection, because it's mostly focused on data minimization and just on the right of the people to authorize what kind of personal data can actually share to provide the minimum requirement for public services. So what we're doing right now is basically working closely with several institutions such as CDPI on defining a broader architecture for this digital identity infrastructure alongside the Civil Registry Authority, for us to start providing different means of not just of data protection around identity, but also how we can actually start building this sort of verified credential standard that works for everybody, and to start having these sort of documents that are actually verifiable, trustworthy, and of course administered by the right authorities at the right time. And for payments, I think this is the area that we have huge advancements, because we have like real-time payments that are actually enabled and effective and available for the universal population. But the way that it's done is not necessarily the most efficient way. So the central bank, which is the owner of that infrastructure, is actually looking at ways to provide a PIX-like solution for the people that is also based on those principles that we're trying to build, and of course trying to have this sort of accountability around the society, and also getting the private sector on board, so that solution, when it comes available to the people, actually gets adopted very easily and quickly. Especially since the country has serious issues when it comes to financial inclusion, because roughly half of the population is financially excluded, and those And regarding the other half that is technically included, roughly 30% are actually the ones that are receiving broader financial services from whether that's digital or not. And we are finding ways to reverse that situation. And of course, having these sort of platforms will allow, especially to do just that. Not necessarily in the way that these have solved the problem in Brazil, but it's one of the options that are actually on the table. And we hope that we're going to find ways to do this in the most inclusive way, but also having this participation for oversight and accountability from all the actors that must be involved into that part.
Thanks, Armando. I think kind of really seeing that sort of spectrum of experiences, right? Sort of, kind of India's very long journey and now kind of Dominican Republic tackling some of the more emerging challenges in this space. I will come to audience questions right after we bring Rasmus in. So if you have a burning question, now is the time to start thinking about it so that you can ask it in a few minutes. Rasmus, maybe turning to you. Estonia is sort of the other major example in the DPI space. And similar to India, I think it has a long legacy of really digitizing e-government services. In fact, e-government is by definition digital, but sort of thinking about e-government services, public to citizen delivery, and solving some of the problems that perhaps Dominican Republic is kind of going through right now, and the whole world is going to think about, how should we think about DPI? What is the right governance model? What are the different ways in which we can really, cut down some of the costs of it, right? So there's many questions on the table, but I would love to know from you, what has Estonia's experience been in this space, one, but also just to build on that, Estonia is also leading on the rights-respecting DPI principles through the Freedom Online Coalition. And so maybe if you can also tie in how Estonia has actually implemented some of those principles in its past, or how it has thought through those principles as it is now thinking about either its legacy DPI or sort of emerging DPI iterations in its work.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, maybe I should start by saying that when in the beginning, when you introduced me as being on the extreme left, I just wanted to clarify that it doesn't necessarily reflect my political views. Anyway, I think many great angles and aspects have been raised, and the questions you are posing to me now also probably would allow for hours of discussion. But of course, I will stick to just some of the main things for now, which would probably be the fundamentals of the DPI, because we have already heard a lot about the practical backgrounds of why DPI is being built and so on. So maybe I will get also to the Freedom Online Coalition's principles of the DPI, as Estonia is in 2025 the chair of the Freedom Online Coalition. But as a representative of Estonia, I definitely can give a bit of a background as to how we have built it up over the course of, for now, I think around 25 years, and how we have managed to tie the fundamentals into the actual digital solutions. So, as I said, Estonia, I think, started with its digital public infrastructure in the beginning of, I believe, 2000 or so, around 25 years ago. And this has really allowed us to see over the years how this digital public infrastructure and all this digital governance has been able to transform the society, and how it has empowered the citizens, and how it has fostered economic growth, and so on. At the same time, of course, we have always been very mindful and vigilant about the risks that this has also brought forward, and we have always tried to mitigate those risks to the best of our knowledge at every certain time or time period when something has been built. Now, many of the principles that already have also been mentioned here during previous interventions I mean, these principles seem to be self-evident, but they don't necessarily self-evidently work within the DPI systems. And there also can be very different understandings of what does it mean, for example, privacy or security within the digital public infrastructure. I will bring you one example, which would be that, for example, when we talk about privacy, then within the DPI, does that mean that the person's data or the information about the person is private to the outside users? Or is it also private on the inside of the DPI, meaning that is there any control or checks and balances on how the, so to speak, the owner of the DPI or the government, how they can access this information about the person. I think these are two different concepts, and that's why, for example, what we have done in Estonia is that one of the very key principles for our DPI is that every citizen is the owner of their own data and has full control of it. In practice, it means that any user, any Estonian citizen can at any time verify which government official or any other person has accessed their personal data within the DPI systems. So this is our way of trying to make sure that there is like preventive accountability for the use of personal data within the DPI. Now, in practice, there are also some other important elements which we have prioritized from the very beginning, and one, of course, would be interoperability, meaning that Estonia's digital public infrastructure works on a platform which is called Crossroad, and the point is that this is a platform that allows for all different institutions to manage their own systems, but they're all interconnected on the same platform, allowing for the citizen to actually be able to access everything from one place, and as I said already, being able to control their own data. Then what was also mentioned and what we have already done since the very beginning is the e-identity, and this is the key or the central part of the whole system, which allows for the people to actually access all the services. And also, I mean, in the case of Estonia, it has already also been taken so far as to be able to participate electronically in the elections and so on. The so-called i-voting, internet voting, we can do it on the computer as well. At the same time, we have been trying to maximize the possibility for people to access all government services, or, well, I don't know if they can be called necessarily government services, but public services, to close in on having 100% of the services being able to be accessed by people, and I think not sure, but I think divorce is now, I think, the only thing that we cannot do online yet. But I think as the society develops, then that will be possible as well. But now, not to waste too much time, just I would run very quickly through the Freedom Online Coalition's work currently, which is for this year in the program of action. Estonia, as the chair, has prioritized rights respecting DPI principles, which obviously would be something that we have already naturally kind of built into our digital public infrastructure. And as the chair of the Freedom Online Coalition, we are hoping that the coalition could bring this to the global attention as well. Many of those principles, as I said before, are quite natural. There is one thing that that is extremely natural, but you cannot write it into anything. It's not a standard, and you cannot even put it as a principle. And this is called trust. The public trust is something that is actually the most important thing. You can force people to do anything, but without trust, you will not get the most out of whatever you're building, because people will not want to use it. But anyway, so trust we have not been able to include into the principles, but what we have included in the principles are the notions of human-centered solutions, meaning that everything has to be focused on humans when we develop technology or digital solutions. Everything must serve this objective. Then something very important, which is inclusivity. And we are feeling very strongly about everybody's need to have access to the internet, to all the digital services and skills in order to be able to benefit from digital transformation. Then we believe that international human rights standards should be followed because otherwise there are too many risks that we will immediately take in undermining the possibility of trust in these discussions. Transparency and accountability, I think, speak for themselves. Everybody probably realizes that we need this to minimize the negative impact of technologies on human rights. Privacy and security we have already talked about. Then societal context. I think everybody agrees that their own societies, their own communities need to be respected with their own particularities and so on. And this is also very important to make any digital public infrastructure work effectively, to take into account the societal context. Then sustainability and resilience. And this is because it is important to build sustainable programs and to be able to maximize long-term impact. Data-driven. DPI must be data-driven because we want to ensure that quality information is available for decision-making. Interoperability, that I mentioned in our case as well, we do want to promote interoperable systems which work together seamlessly across organizations. It will make everything cheaper, it will make everything more effective, it will be easier for both the users and the administrators or managers of the systems. Then, of course, technology neutrality, because we believe that the digital public infrastructure should be built in a technology-neutral manner. Openness, of course, open approach to digital development. It means open standards, open source, open data. This is something that will nicely tie in with privacy and security. And finally, of course, collaboration, meaning both collaboration domestically and also on the international level. So these are the principles the Freedom Online Coalition is currently working on. We hope to be able to adopt them during this year, and then they may be able to serve as some like a guiding light to everybody who wishes to further develop their own digital public infrastructure. Thank you.
Thanks, Rasmus. A very comprehensive set of principles, I think, for all of our stakeholders to think through. We've reached, we don't have a lot of time for our panel, so I'm curious if anybody in the audience here has any questions that they would like to ask the panel. There's mics there, but we're also a very intimate room, so also I think I can hear if people are speaking.
Or maybe if online also.
We actually have an online question, but I wanted to make sure there's anybody. Okay, great. I think we have an online question. I think Rasmus touched on it a little bit more, so maybe. Oh, there is. Okay, yes. Thank you.
You should take the mic.
Yeah, maybe the mic will be useful.
Thank you very much for this insightful question. My name is Elizabeth. My first, I have two questions, if you don't mind. My first question is to Professor Belli. Thank you very much for the insights around like collaboration between government and other stakeholders. I had worked with the government of Nigeria on digital policy reforms, one of which was digitizing business registration processes to reduce the time, the cost, and the procedure of doing business. And my experience with public service is there's still that gap in terms of building that sort of entrepreneurial mindset in seeing how this could be of great benefit and then fully owning this service, service delivery to the public. So I now currently work with a mobile industry association, and the big question is for telcos, mobile network operators, what are like the opportunities in terms of collaborating with government, because there's this buzz around mobile data. Increasingly, mobile devices are becoming very instrumental in increasing access to public services, to digital services across the world, especially in emerging markets. So I don't know if you could share some examples and some insights on that. That would be great. The second question I have is to Professor Breckenridge from the session on South Africa, and also to Simriti. I'm so sorry, I try my best to pronounce it properly. And is on digital financial inclusion. So the comment around us really thinking through on how we can guard against digital financial inclusion not being a risk, more or less an innovation addressing the problem as opposed to being a risk for misuse, abuse, data harvesting, and the likes. And it got me thinking around AI ethics and transparency. And my question is to Professor Breckenridge, in South Africa, what would you say are like top priorities in terms of building this very strong AI ethical standards around that? And for Simriti, I'm sorry once again, is in the context of digital financial inclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before I go to the panelists to respond to this question, we also have some online question along the same lines, so maybe I can tie the two questions together just in the interest of time. I think we also have an online question that is also asking similar sort of approaches to how do we actually weave in some of the human rights principles within the DPI architecture. And then particularly just speaking on the AI piece, we are now also seeing a moment where using the existing DPI, a lot of AI developments are happening, a lot of API access is being provided, and sort of that architecture is also scaling some of the AI expansion, particularly in the global majority. So as we think about these expansions, how do we actually weave in some of these principles that Rasmus mentioned, but also some of the learnings that we have had in the past, and where do the different stakeholders that we have, whether it's civil society, technical communities, what could their different roles be? So that's a question from the online audience, and maybe it'll be a good way to kind of weave them in. So maybe, Luca, since we can start with you, and then I can maybe turn to some of the other speakers.
Yeah, I think those questions are excellent and actually allow me to delve a little bit more into the details of what could be the success or the failure of these kind of efforts. I think that as anything in digital, one has to consider that we are dealing with systems, right? There are a lot of elements and a lot of layers. I like the India stack vision because it re-visualizes that the system has layers and you have to consider them all to be successful. And I think that this is one of the reasons why the Brazilian Central Bank was successful in implementing PIX. The other reason is because they are a very independent, well-resourced institution, which is key for the success of the DPIs, knowing that the institution that implement them understand what they are doing, they have the resources to do this, both intellectual and financial resources to stimulate this, and they are able to implement it with other stakeholders. So this is a very good example of how multi-stakeholder cooperation can work. And in the case of PIX and the Brazilian Central Bank, they really understood that it was not only the PIX, but it was how the PIX was introduced, and they understood very well the system. Let me give you a very concrete example of why. So Brazil, as most Global South countries, although Brazil has a very good level of connectivity, most of the country is not meaningfully connected. They are, as most of the Global South, we are connected through zero-rated services, primarily the Meta family of services, so social media, and all the rest is very expensive. So if you want to introduce a new digital service, government, a DPI, people will not use it because they have to spend money. And that is why when the Brazilian government was going to introduce PIX and Meta proposed to introduce WhatsApp payment 3 months before the PIX, the Brazilian central bank had the power to block this and to postpone Meta introduction of WhatsApp payment after the PIX entered in force due to competition, data protection, and consumer protection reasons. So they understood very well that if WhatsApp had introduced WhatsApp payment before the PIX, today we would not be celebrating the PIX as a great success. Everyone in Brazil would be using WhatsApp payment. And that leads me also to celebrate another great success of India, and I think that colleagues from the Telecoms Regulatory Authority of India should be really praised for their vision in 2016 when they adopted very strong net neutrality rules that prohibited zero rating in India. And I think that the reason why DPIs have been so successful in India, and I think this is the greatest untold story of good digital sovereignty. India prohibited zero rating in 2016. It's the only global south country that did this, and the result is not only that connectivity prices have dropped by 90%, and connectivity has boomed, more than 300% of adoption and increase in the past 8 years, but also that India is experiencing a belle epoque of innovation. Why? Because you can access everything. You don't have only social media for free and all the rest extremely expensive. Everything is cheap. And that is something that you need to consider. So you need really to have a systemic vision before thinking about the DPI. And also you need to have an institution that is able to implement that vision. And we had this chance in Brazil with the Brazilian Central Bank. I'm not sure all other institutions would be able to do this same success.
Thanks, Lucas. Maybe I'll turn to the question specifically to you and the role of different stakeholders in that process.
Yeah, thanks for that question. On the financial inclusion question and stakeholders in that process, I think it's an important question to think about what were the causes of exclusion. And I think to the extent ID was a cause, we have seen DPIs addressing that, but there is, I think, an underlying question that, what sort of ID did you need? Do you necessarily need a biometric-based ID to solve for financial inclusion? I think those are the debates to be had. Like certainly, recognition and being able to verify and identify is a building block. The other question, I think, which is important to the DPI conversation is about, how do you define financial inclusion? Is it only about payments and remittances? A lot of the DPI focus is around that, or is it about a broader bouquet of financial services? And are we thinking about, insurance? Are we thinking about, other services which are also a part of financial inclusion? And finally, with digitization, the frauds that we are seeing, the cyber risk that we are seeing, are we thinking about DPI on those fronts? So far, we don't very actively. We seem to be solving those through DPI, and I think that's where, the next layer of thinking should be.
Thanks, Meeti. Keith, there's a question specifically for South Africa as well, from your experience. And then maybe just... Sorry? Go ahead.
I don't think it's a South African question. I think it's a global question. And for me, the first question is the liability question. Who should take responsibility? Someone finds out your information on Facebook, uses a network provider to send you an enticing SMS. You click on the link, and then your pension fund is gone, And this is happening, let's be honest, it's happening to, a significant proportion of the populations that are meant to be basically getting resources and capabilities from this. And I think it may be I'm the age, so I'm 60, which means I spend quite a lot of time working with people who are 85, 90, old people, the normal old people who are the actual targets. They're not 25-year-old Estonians, they're 80-year-old Africans, and they really don't have the skill set that they need, that the designers of these systems are assuming are actually available to them. They don't see the buttons, they can't read the text. It's so easy for them to be robbed. I mean, it's truly a joke. And no one is really looking at this. No one wants to take it seriously. The only people who are, of course, are the English. The British are doing this, and they've imposed an £85,000 liability on the banks, regardless of what happens. Someone empties your bank account, the banks are responsible. And that's, as far as I can see, the only country in the world that's doing that. And when we start talking about sharing liability, the network providers will stop allowing criminal SMSs to flow on their systems. Then we can talk. So if we're doing this let's be aware of what we're doing. We're building an infrastructure that's going to make a huge population newly vulnerable to really serious crimes, and there's no discussion of what we should be doing about that. So I would start with that. I think that the second issue for me is really the question about asset creation. I'm much more worried about asset creation than I am about what we could call usurious, interest rates. It's people need to be getting something out of these mobile systems. It's not enough to make it a kind of subsistence question. We have to look for how people can buy things, material things that they can keep and not turn it towards consumption. And that for me is fundamentally a matter of fiduciaries and also these kind of collective forms of savings association that are very common everywhere. You find them of one kind or another. They're very normal, but DPI privileges what we could call individual biographical credit surveillance. It gives you an ID number that makes the ID number the core of the credit scoring system. It's also one of the reasons why everywhere, even in the US, firms are much less visible. That's the real problem we've got here. And again, I'd like to hear the engineers who are building this huge infrastructure that's putting us all at risk speak about the implications of that.
Thanks, Keith. In the interest of time, maybe I'm going to, probably not come back to Sriti, Luca, and Keith, but actually give Vidisha, Armando, Mr. Singh here, and Rasmus a chance to give their closing remarks with like one quick question, which is also from the participants, is really how do we think about weaving in these principles into DPI governance? Some are very legacy systems, some are newer systems, so how do we actually do it? So maybe a quick 30-second, I'll start with Rasmus.
Well, I will use my 30 seconds to maybe be quiet. I don't know how to actually do it. I can only maybe refer to or reuse something I said 10 years ago, and with reference with what Keith was mentioning about old people, young people, that I am firmly confident that old people are not as stupid as we think they are, and young people are not as smart as we think they are, even in digital.
Fair point. Vidisha.
Yeah, I also don't have a profound thought last, closing statement. But I think one thing that in the discussion we see that India being this success story in terms, or other countries being success story in terms of how many people have bank accounts or how many people So my broader question would be like, is digitalization equal to inclusion? Is the question that I think I would end with.
Thanks, Vidisha. Armando.
Well, building on the same statements that preceded me, basically, I just want to remark that to earn people's trust, DPIs must be more than efficient. It must be ethical, inclusive, and accountable. And that means that safeguards, on AI, on the broad DPI effort, should be codified into law, should be embedded into law, ensuring that civil society has a seat on the table, and making systems transparent and auditable. We in the Dominican Republic, we're actually trying to do that. We're committed to building a DPI, not just as a government infrastructure, but rather a civic infrastructure that are governed not just by code, but by values that protects people and empowers them to achieve their very best. That's all I can say.
Thanks, Armando. Over to you, Mr. Singh. Last word.
I would just like to say that any DPI or any system which is being built has to be user-centric, citizen-centric, and the goal and the principles have to be to how the society is to be served. That is the basic principles, and everything else can be actually built. There are no issues.
Great, wonderful. On that closing thought of building people-centered DPI, thank you everyone for joining in on our panel. I'm sure lunch is being served right now, so I hope to continue the conversation. Thank you for online participants for joining and staying on, and look forward to the next IGF. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.